It's interesting to note that with all the talk of science and all the enormous efforts we have to promote science, that all our focus on science is on the process of validation of discovery, but not really on the process of discovery itself. I mentioned Popper here, and he's quoted, and there are many great scientists, including Einstein and many others, who have said that the real creative part of their process was not due to a logical function of the thinking mind in the normal sense that we know it, and for want of a better term or any other term, it's been referred to as intuitive. The logical processes, the processes that we test, that we do to validate truth, are certainly very important. That makes up the body of science. But I've often wondered, why is it that we're not spending a lot more effort trying to understand the other side of the process? Today, it looks like a black box to us. We give it a name that we don't really understand. But does that mean there's really something we can't understand about it? And if we could understand more about it, perhaps we could not just do better validation, but we could do a much better creative way of formulating hypotheses in the first place. Ivo and I wrote an article a couple of years ago, published in Cadmus, on the issue of recognizing unrecognized genius. And that article really focused on, are there some common characteristics of the action of what we call genius? And I was talking about intellectual genius or mental genius or scientific genius, not going into the other aspects of it. What do we really know about that process? So I wanted to walk through some basic thoughts about what we call thinking and what we know about the thinking process and how it may relate to this issue. And I wanted to start, which comes back to something that Pierre said, and that is, we don't always think about it, but our basic mental processes have a strong bias for physical reality. That may sound like a contradiction in terms, isn't reality physical? Assuming that the reality is physical, the mind is trained, conditioned, and naturally, just because of our biological evolution, our senses develop before our thinking develops, our sensory faculties develop before our conceptual faculties mature. So we tend to look at things physically. Our first perception of the earth is that the sun is moving and we're standing still, because that's what our senses tell us. Science has evolved way beyond the senses, but still in our thinking processes, we tend to give a primacy to the physical. So I raise a basic question, and that is the reality of knowledge that we're looking for material, emotional, conceptual, or something else? And my purpose today is not to, we've already, Stephen was talking about education of consciousness. I'm not even going to go there. I think we know that our conscious life, we very much live in our thoughts. It's not really clear what those thoughts are. We live very much in our emotions. Neuroscience may tell us that there's a chemical and electrical component to our thinking and our emotions, but it's not inherently obvious that that is the entire reality of them. Yet, our thinking processes in general, not just with regard to ourselves, are very much conditioned to say that, to give a primacy or an emphasis to what is physically verifiable and apparent, because of our dependence on the senses. Maybe sometime last year, there was an American psychologist who did a presentation on, I think it was one of the TED videos, in which he claimed to have discovered the hormone for morality. Assuming that morality and other psychological states and ethical and highest ethical behavior must have an entirely physical explanation. I give it as an explanation. Nobody in the audience thought to question, is morality necessarily entirely explained in neurochemical terms? So we have a tendency not only to do that with external phenomenon or our observation of others, but as it was already mentioned yesterday, we tend to, and our education tends to, downgrade the value or the reality of the subjective dimension, even though that's what we live in to such a powerful extent. I'm pointing this out simply to try to make it more conscious of the fact that when we're talking about mind and thinking, there is an inherent bias, and certainly in our education. We see that very much in the study of economic theory or of all the social science theory, because the predominant tendency is to look for external, physical, systemic explanations for phenomena that are very much dependent on psychological and social perceptions. I mean, in a very short period of time, about $4 trillion disappeared from the world's wealth simply because we changed our minds about what the reality was. And now we're seeing in China something similar. So I'm just trying to point this out, so when we think about the way we think, are we really thinking about the inherent biases or premises regarding what the reality is? I like this. This is a quote from Sri Aurobindo, an Indian philosopher. He said, "The unrealized is not necessarily the unrealizable. Yet, we do have an inherent bias to believe in the reality of what exists today and to downplay the reality of what has not yet materialized. As if it may be inevitable, but because it's not there, it's not intelligible to our senses yet, it's in some sense not fully real." And yesterday we had the example of the reunification of Germany as an example. If you look at great scientific discoveries, and this slide is based very much on a book by Lee Smolin, The Trouble with Physics, in which and Ivo and I drew on this material. He summarized great scientific discoveries in physics and commented that the thing they tend to have in common is they unify phenomena that appear to be independent or not fully related to one another. And I've given a few examples here. And these are people who we attribute to have genius, the capacity to find relationships between things that are apparently unrelated to one another. Does that tell us something about our thought processes? And I'm going to argue about how we can develop our thought processes or change our emphasis in education. So the capacity to conceive of apparent contradictions as complementary dimensions of a wider reality is one characteristic of genius. And the question is, can it be taught? This is a simple framework for thinking about a very complex phenomenon of the characteristic ways in which the thinking mind works. We're all familiar with the first row, the analytic thinking, which is we focus on a part of reality, we take it for the whole reality, we zoom down to the more specific, and analytic thinking has a tremendous capacity to give us knowledge of the part, the uniqueness of the part, what distinguishes it from everything else. We have another capacity of mind, and that is to try to see the big picture. But when the mind tries to see the big picture, we end up not really seeing the integrity of the whole. We end up seeing lots of parts of the whole. We end up kind of adding up all the parts that we've divided. So when we talk about education, we list 50 disciplines or 1,000 subdisciplines, and we say education includes all of those things. And we have added a lot of things to the list in the last 2 days. What we call synthetic, what I'm calling here synthetic, is more an attempt to piece together all of the pieces which have already been fragmented. And systems thinking has made a major advance in the sciences in the last century by trying to conceive of the whole that relates a lot of things that we thought were separate and often independent. And we're looking for what's the commonality, what's the relationship between these discrete parts or discrete steps in an operation. I'm trying to point towards a third type of thinking, which for want of a better word, I'm calling it integrative. Maybe I should have called it integrated. That really sees things at the fundamental level of where there is a oneness between them, at an essential level, rather than seeing their uniqueness, rather than even seeing their commonality. We look at where, at an essential level, where they really are the same phenomena. Last September, we had a 6-day course here on what we call Towards the Transdisciplinary Science of Society, where we were really trying to focus on what do all the social sciences have in common. In the natural sciences, whether you're a physicist, a chemist, an astronomer, a geologist, a meteorologist, or whatever else it is, we all start with a common base. There are fundamental principles that are common to all of these sciences. There are physical principles, chemical principles, and so forth. Yet in the social sciences, even when we try to link things together, and one of the questions we had from one of our online students was, what's the difference between multidisciplinary or cross-disciplinary and transdisciplinary? And I think that my answer to that would be, multidisciplinary, we try to piece things together and look at their relationship. Transdisciplinary, we're trying to see, are there common processes? Are there common processes that are there in all human activity, regardless whether it's in the economic sphere, the social sphere? And we've had very rich discussion on this. So I'm raising this from the point of view of which is the type of thinking that we are consciously developing in our educational system, and how much emphasis is there on each, and is it possible in any or every subject to shift the focus more from the analytical, which we know well and which is what our modern science has been founded on, more down this list. And just to illustrate this, we're all in economics very familiar with the debate, the ongoing debate between neoliberalism and neo-Keynesianism and other varieties. And we hear the back and forth discussion on and on, going on and on as to which perspective is right, with the inherent assumption that one is right and one is wrong, that we have to choose one is right as one is wrong. It's truth versus truth. I think this is very characteristic of when we look at phenomenon from an analytic point of view. We end up wanting to find out which one's right and which one's wrong. When we try to look holistically, we try to see, well, in fact, markets are very important because you can't really have productive economic activity without freedom for human initiative, but in fact, you really can't have markets and free markets without regulation. And it's not a question of whether we need freedom or we need regulation. Without a proper balance between both of them, we don't have anything. The reality is more complex. We have to look at both sides. If you wanted to take it to a deeper level, haven't we oversimplified reality, grossly oversimplified reality? Because the real productive wealth and activity of a society depends on the relationship between creative, dynamic individuals and the society which supports, gives freedom, draws on their capacity and develops the capacity of all the people around them. And isn't this whole debate between freedom and regulation a gross oversimplification of the reality, which has a fundamental basis in human social processes? It depends on how much energy the society generates. It depends on the organizational capabilities. It depends on the aspirations of the people. It depends on our awareness and perceptions. It depends on our values and all. So I'm just trying to use this as an example to illustrate why maybe we can think about working out a shift in the emphasis. It doesn't mean there's not a role for analysis, and there's certainly a role for synthesis, but can't we, within the existing subject matter, move down the line? And I'll close with just one more, a book I recently came across, which I found I resonated with a lot. Perhaps some of you are familiar with his thought. I'd recommend it, by William Byers. It's called Deep Thinking. I had already prepared my presentation before I read this book, but I found it. He's a Canadian mathematician, but he's essentially made clear to me some things that we've been working on in the academy for years, but I never had a real clarity of how to express it. His point is that all knowledge is based on a conceptual framework. We cannot know anything without having a conceptual framework. Our language, our definitions, our vocabulary is a conceptual framework. And he starts, I'm not going to go into it, but he starts even just in basic mathematics. He says there are two fundamental conceptual frameworks with which we start with basic mathematics, and that is one, that the numbers represent a count of things, and the other is that the numbers represent distances, quantities. And these are two essentially different things. And soon we get into the fact that numbers can represent fractions of a whole, which is an entirely different conceptual framework. And later on, somebody asked us to deduct 8 from 5, and we say you can't deduct 8 from 5 because there's only 5 things to take away. And that, no, you see, we can have a negative. We can have a conception of a negative number, which is a new paradigm. And his point is, from the beginnings of our education, we are learning new paradigms. The characteristic of a paradigm is, from within the existing paradigm, the perspective from outside that paradigm makes no sense. And problems that confront us, which we're unable to solve, appear because we insist on limiting ourselves within the existing paradigm. Well, when I read this, I said, well, this is exactly the conclusion we came to in the World Academy. That the problems that we're facing today, we cannot solve within the existing intellectual framework, whether it's economics or political science or sociology or ecology, whatever it is. But it's so difficult from within that to get out. Once you get out, once you look at the wider paradigm, it doesn't negate the other paradigms. It doesn't say economics is all wrong or political science. It simply says they're part of a wider whole, and we have to understand them from a wider perspective. Byers' point is that we've been learning new paradigms all our life, but we've been learning the new paradigms that humanity has discovered over a few thousand years, and nobody's told us they're new paradigms. Maybe when you get from analytic geometry to nonlinear, or from linear geometry to nonlinear geometry, you scratch your head for a long time, and somebody finally tells you this is a whole new paradigm of reality. But we have been growing and evolving, and we are capable of that development. So I was asking myself, nobody ever told me through my education this simple principle that all this time, as I have been learning more of accumulated knowledge, that there are times when we're moving to an entirely new paradigm. I think for the physicists it's most obvious, moving from a geocentric to a heliocentric universe, or from Newtonian physics to relativity and so forth. The physicists are those who are most qualified from their conscious experience to know they didn't negate Newtonian physics. They saw it as a special case of a much wider phenomenon. How much, I don't know how far in physics, physicists are being taught to try to look beyond the paradigm. We accept the paradigms that have been discovered, but I certainly think in the social sciences or in other fields, I don't think it's very conscious. Imagine if the educational process we had, we don't have to go into, with the same existing knowledge, if we can teach the knowledge we're teaching and make conscious the transitions that we've already made, and make conscious the process by which we transit from one paradigm to another, as we are from an economic to an ecological paradigm or a human-centered paradigm, the more conscious we are of that. That's what I was thinking of as conscious education when you spoke this morning, Stephen. Wouldn't we be creating not just a knowledge, but we'd be creating the capacity to create, and as Ivo often says, to come out of the box?